There was a clock set at the beginning, not the kind that hangs on a wall, not the kind measured in seconds or minutes, or the brief seasons of a human life. A clock measured in generations, in empires, in the rise and fall of nations. A clock whose hands move through the turning of centuries, and whose final hour has been the subject of prophets, scholars, and ordinary men and women, for as long as human memory stretches back into the ancient dark. This is that story. Not a warning, not a sermon, but a chronicle, a careful, faithful tracing of what the ancient scriptures say about the years that lead to the return of the one they called the Son of Man. According to the biblical chronology, there is a shape to history, a design beneath the surface of events, a structure that does not bend to political convenience or personal interpretation, but moves slowly and with terrible patience toward a single appointed moment. We begin, as all things begin, at the beginning. Act 1, the beginning of the timeline. Long before the Roman roads were laid, long before the Greek philosophers set ink to papyrus, long before the great empires of Assyria and Babylon carved their names into the stone of the ancient world, a Hebrew prophet received a vision. His name was Daniel. He stood at the edge of one of the most catastrophic moments in Jewish history. Jerusalem had fallen, the temple had been destroyed. The people of Israel had been carried into captivity, into the shadow of a foreign empire, and it seemed as though the story of God's covenant people had simply ended. But in that darkness, in that moment of apparent dissolution, something extraordinary happened. The angel Gabriel came to him, and Gabriel brought not comfort, but a clock. 70 weeks, the angel said, are determined for your people and for your holy city. 70 weeks, not weeks of days, but weeks of years. 70 groups of 7 years, a total of 490 years. Many scholars interpret this passage as one of the most precise prophetic timelines in the entirety of human literature. The clock would begin, Gabriel explained, with a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. It would run through 69 of those sevens, 483 years, leading directly to the coming of the Anointed One. And mathematicians who have traced the calendar have noted with remarkable precision that those 483 years counted from the decree of the Persian king Artaxerxes in the 5th century before the Common Era, land with extraordinary accuracy at the moment of the Messiah's entry into Jerusalem. 69 weeks, accounted for, confirmed, sealed. But the 70th week, the final 7 years, was left open, suspended, like a breath held at the edge of a great storm. The scholars who have devoted their lives to this text speak of a gap, an interval of time between the 69th and 70th week, during which history would continue its long and turbulent journey. Empires would rise and fall. Rome would ascend and collapse. Christendom would spread across the earth. Centuries would pass. Millennia would accumulate. And still, the clock would wait. This is the foundation of the biblical timeline as understood through the lens of eschatology. Not a vague spiritual impression, but a structured architectural prophecy that identifies a beginning, a sequence, and an end. The 69 weeks were fulfilled. The final week is yet to come, and between them, the age in which we now live. Act 2, the pattern through history. The ancient text of the book of Daniel does not stand alone. Across the centuries, other voices added their testimony to the framework that Gabriel had laid out. Prophets in the tradition of Isaiah, the great visionary literature of Ezekiel, the fierce and luminous voices of the minor prophets, each of them adding another layer to a picture that, viewed from a sufficient distance, reveals something astonishing in its coherence, a pattern, not random events, not the chaotic collision of historical forces without meaning, but a pattern, a repeating structure of departure, judgment, mercy, and restoration that runs through the entire biblical narrative like a thread of gold through ancient cloth. One of the most significant signals within this pattern is what many scholars describe as the sign of the fig tree. In the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus sits with his disciples on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the city of Jerusalem, and he speaks of the end of the age. His disciples ask him 3 questions. They want to know when the temple will fall. They want to know what the sign of his coming will be. And they want to know what will signal the end of the present order of things. His answer is a long and carefully structured discourse. Wars, famines, earthquakes in various places. The beginning of sorrows, the first tremors before the great shaking. The persecution of believers, the love of many growing cold as lawlessness multiplies, the gospel being preached to all nations before the end arrives, and then a parable. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. Many scholars of biblical prophecy across multiple traditions have understood this parable as pointing toward the restoration of the nation of Israel. The fig tree, in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, is one of the most persistent symbols for the nation of God's covenant people. A tree stripped bare through centuries of exile and dispossession, and then, in the appointed hour, budding again. The establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 stands as one of the most referenced anchors in biblical eschatology. Whether one accepts the theological interpretation or approaches it as historical observation alone, the sheer improbability of a dispersed people scattered across the face of the earth for nearly 2,000 years, reconstituting themselves as a sovereign nation in their ancestral land, is a fact without clear parallel in the history of human civilization. The fig tree had budded, and the disciples had been told, "When you see this, know that it is near, even at the very doors." But what exactly is it that is near? The answer, according to the scriptural architecture, circles back to Daniel's 70th week. Many interpreters across multiple traditions describe a period of 7 years immediately preceding the return of Christ, a final and concentrated chapter of history in which the structures of the present age are shaken to their foundations. This period, referred to across different theological schools by different names, is most commonly described in the language of the book of Revelation as the Great Tribulation. It begins, according to Daniel's account, with a covenant, a treaty, a formal agreement made between a world leader of extraordinary power and the people and the land at the center of the prophetic timeline. For 3.5 years, this covenant holds. The prophetic clock resumes its movement, and the world appears, perhaps for a brief and deceptive moment, to breathe a sigh of relief. But at the midpoint of that final 7 years, the agreement is broken. The one who made the covenant reveals a different face, and the period that follows is described in the scriptures with a gravity that sets it apart from every other era of human suffering. In the words attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, "There will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again." This is the final descent before the dawn. The book of Revelation, the last text in the biblical canon, maps this period through a series of escalating judgments, seals opened, trumpets sounded, bowls poured out upon the earth. Many scholars who have devoted careful attention to the structure of these judgments note that they are not strictly sequential in simple linear order, but overlapping, reinforcing, a crescendo of converging forces. The seals and the trumpets occupy the full span of the 7-year period. The bowls, poured out in rapid succession, belong to the final concentrated days before the climax of the age. The imagery is unforgettable. Wars on a scale that threatens human survival, ecological catastrophe, economic collapse. A central figure, described as the man of lawlessness who commands worship on a global scale and whose claims reach into the sacred spaces of the earth. 2 witnesses who prophesy in the streets of Jerusalem and cannot be silenced until their appointed hour. The gathering of the armies of the nations to a valley in the north of Israel, a place whose ancient name has become synonymous with final conflict. Armageddon, the pattern that runs through the whole of Scripture, converges here. Every thread of the prophetic narrative, every vision, every symbol, every warning arrives at this single point of gathering. And then, the silence before the last trumpet sounds. Act 3. The present moment. We stand now in a remarkable moment of history. Not because the sky is falling, not because the news carries more darkness than it can hold, but because the structural conditions that the biblical texts identify as prerequisites for the final chapter of the age are, by any careful and honest reading, more visibly assembled than at any previous point in recorded history. The nation that the prophets described as the center of the end-time narrative exists, restored, contested, surrounded, precisely as described. The capacity for global governance, global surveillance, and global economic control, which the prophetic texts describe as central to the final age, now exists in ways that were simply not possible in any previous generation. The gospel has now been carried, through technology and translation and extraordinary human effort, into virtually every language and every people group on the face of the earth, fulfilling what was described as a condition that must precede the end. The alignment of the nations described in the ancient texts of Daniel and Ezekiel, a coalition of powers from the north and the east and the south, bearing down on the land at the center of the prophetic map, is no longer the language of distant imagination. It is recognizable in the geopolitical architecture of the present hour. Paul, writing to the early communities of the 1st century, described what would characterize the last days with an almost uncomfortable specificity. People devoted to themselves, proud, ungrateful, without natural affection, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, holding a form of religious observance while denying its substance. No one who reads that passage honestly and then looks at the landscape of the present culture can claim it sounds distant. Yet the scriptures are equally clear about something else: the day and the hour. No one knows, not the angels, not the prophets, not any voice in any generation that has risen to announce the precise coordinates of the final hour. Every attempt across 2,000 years of Christian history to pin a date to the return of Christ has collapsed under the weight of its own presumption. The text is not ambiguous about this. It is decisive. The signs are given, not as a calendar, but as a compass. They orient, they prepare, they awaken, but they do not permit the calculation that human impatience so desperately desires. What they do permit is discernment. The biblical scholar who has spent a lifetime inside this material does not emerge from it with panic. They emerge with something more useful and more enduring than panic. They emerge with perspective. They see that history, as the scriptures describe it, is not an accident. It is not the random collision of blind forces. It is a narrative, with a beginning that was declared before the first word of creation was spoken, and an ending that was settled before the first human being drew breath. The 70 weeks of Daniel stand as the clearest evidence of this. 483 years, predicted centuries in advance, fulfilled with precision that defies the categories of coincidence, and the final 7 years still waiting, still suspended, still held in the hand of the one who set the clock in motion. If that chronology holds to its own internal logic, if the pattern that has governed the first 69 weeks governs the 70th with equal faithfulness, then the world is not drifting. It is moving, not toward chaos, though it may feel that way in the hours before the dawn, not toward annihilation, though the final passage is described in language that is not gentle, but toward resolution, toward the moment when the one who was announced by the prophets, confirmed by the centuries, and whose first arrival was predicted to the year, arrives again, not in concealment, not in the quietness of a stable in an occupied province, but, as the texts describe it, as lightning that flashes from the east to the west, visible to every eye, unmistakable to every generation that remains. The timeline was given not to generate fear. It was given, the texts themselves suggest, so that when these things begin to happen, the people who have studied the map would not be surprised. They would look up, because the ancient scriptures teach that when the final movements of the pattern come into clarity, it means the end of one story and the beginning of another. History moves forward, patterns repeat, and if the structure of the timeline holds, then the story is not random. It is moving toward something